Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the Slappyworld book series, and it's book number 8, The Dummy Meets the Mummy. I just want to get this off my chest. This was a pleasant surprise of a Goosebumps book. You know, I've read a lot of these by this point, and all of the moderns are brand new to me. And I love it when I come across a modern that I'm willing to say I love in some ways. And this is a book that is no exception, y'all. I love a lot about this book. And if you haven't read this book before, you're really missing out on something truly special in the Goosebumps franchise. Now, when I first got back into collecting in 2020, I heard a lot of hype about certain Goosebumps books from the modern era. Specifically like Scream of the Haunted Mask, It's Alive, It's Alive, books like that. But this one was also thrown around by a bunch of people. And I figured that at one point I would get around to doing some Slappy stories from the Slappyworld series. And I'm glad I picked this one first because, you know, I've been reading through the Mummy books and I wanted to get this one to kind of like, you know, kill two birds with one stone, get my first Slappy book in the Slappyworld series done, and to wrap up the Mummy stories. And I'm glad... like I said, I'm glad I chose this one because this one was a fun experience. And that's all you can ask for with Goosebumps books. If you're a nostalgic person, and let's say you grew up in the 90s with the original series, maybe you read give yourself Goosebumps books, some Series 2000, maybe even the Tales series, and you haven't touched any modern Goosebumps books, this one would be a fun one to start with, and I put a hard stamp on that. You must try this at some point if you're a Goosebumps fan. This was a fun little romp. Not perfect, and we'll get into that near the end of the video, but I was pleasantly surprised. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. Now, this book is a bit different in the layout of Goosebumps books that you typically see. Not in the sense that, you know, Goosebumps books don't sometimes have prologues or anything, but this book has multiple character perspectives, kind of similar to books like One of the Haunted Mask, but I think this is a better version of that setup, and it's fantastic in terms of its setup. But the story starts off with like a 4-chapter prologue, and this doctor, I can't pronounce his last name, but I'm just going to call him Dr. K. Dr. K is this Egyptologist / archaeologist touring Egyptian ruins in Egypt, and he's after this tomb of this pharaoh called what's his name? I just had it in my name. Aragotis. Alright, so he's after this tomb of this pharaoh called Aragotis, which is fabled to be a one-day pharaoh of Egypt. He tried to ascend to the throne, but he was assassinated before he could ever rule. And it's said in legends that he was turned into a mummy, and there's inscriptions associated with him that insinuate that he is still seeking vengeance for what happened to him and can awaken due to a spell. Well, he and fellow colleagues end up finding the actual burial tomb of Aragotis. And they remove this giant stone slab and reveal his body just laying in there. And nearby, there are some symbols that have to be transcribed. And there's a scribe amongst the team that Dr. K has enlisted to help that has translated it, and it reads this magic spell. And once it happens, Aragotis comes to life. And what he does to Dr. K is very graphic. I was shocked at what was put into page here. This has to be one of the most graphic things I have read in a Goosebumps book since One of the Haunted Mask prologue. And if you've read that, you know what I'm talking about. That was outright brutal. There's a scene dealing with a mustache and skin ripping off. It's very graphic, and there's blood. Yeah. I was not expecting that, but wow. And everybody, of course, freaks out. They reread the spell and they happen to put Aragotis back to sleep, Well, Aragotis, before he got put back to sleep, pretty much destroyed the face of this man. And he was sent to this hospital to get facial reconstruction surgery. And there he urged, after he woke up after surgery, to get rid of this mummy at all costs. It's not worth it. They need to make some finances back from this expedition. Whatever it takes to get rid of him, by all means do it. And that ends part 1 of the story. Now, part 2, it's kind of jarring, but you'll get what it's trying to do once you read through it. So part 2 picks up with this kid named Aaron and his family. And Aaron has just attended school that day, and he met with this puppeteer guy. And this puppeteer had given him a dummy in a case. And the dummy in the case came with papers and all that, and he's excited, and he wants to show his family when he gets home that day. And they open up the case, and the dummy ends up being Slappy. And Slappy happens to already be awake and alive. And they kind of glance some papers after Slappy makes some quips and jokes and some insults to some of the family members. And they realize that something is unnatural with this dummy. And Slappy, in the vein of Slappy, I don't really like all that much, but since this is like the 3rd or 4th book with him doing this now, I guess it's the new norm of Slappy doing this, where he acts like Mr. Wood from the original Dummy book. Slappy pretty much terrorizes the entire family and spews green vomit all over them while they're trying to eat dinner. And there's some funny things dealing with the father and stuff, where he's trying to eat and nobody else likes the mom's cooking and stuff. Some funny jokes there. But this essentially scars the whole family, and everybody's saying, you need to get rid of this dummy now. And the dad manages to wrestle Slappy into this chest and takes him off, drives off, and we don't know what ends up happening to Slappy until part 3. Now, part 3 is where you meet the main character of the book for the rest of the story. And her name is Kathy. And Kathy, her sister, and her cousin all hang out at this museum run by her father. And her father runs this horror museum. It's called the Haunted Horror Museum in their town. And the father likes to collect horror memorabilia, like posters, books, and stuff, and likes to put on exhibits. And they just got news that the father has just acquired a mummy from overseas, and he's finally going to fulfill his wish of getting a mummy. And it's to be implied that it's going to be Aragotis from the prologue. Well, when they are talking about the mummy and getting excited, the father ends up leaving to get some preparation things, because the following night they're going to have a sleepover for the town school. And they do this annually, where kids get to come and stay overnight in the haunted museum, and they get to go on like special exhibits and eat pizza and do all this fun stuff, and it just sounds so cool, right? And they're trying to go out and get all this, party supply stuff done. Well, Kathy stays behind with I think her sister or something, maybe her cousin, and they get a knock. And right before they leave, the uncle also answers, and they get a chest dropped off to him with no name. The uncle peels off, and the kids, they already open up the chest, and they see that it's this dummy inside. And this dummy seems to be talking, doing some things that aren't really natural. And they notice papers down in the bottom of it, and they're going through all these papers, and the uncle kind of went through it too before he left. And the kids now realize that this dummy might be alive, and there's something in the papers that gets to potentially turn him off. And before they get into big trouble with Slappy, they manage to turn him off with Slappy's iconic spell, which I've already brought up in another book that previously did this. I don't like this. I don't like why Stein has changed the continuity up at this point, but I guess it's now a thing, so it's not a one-off thing, so I guess I can excuse it here. But the spell manages to turn Slappy off, and everything seems kind of weird. When the dad gets back, the kids try to urge the dad that this stuff has happened, and the dad's like, well, I'll go lock him away just in case, right? Well, almost simultaneously, it's coming up to a few hours before the event of this, sleepaway party with the school. And Aragotis is revealed to be the mummy that's going to be on this exhibit that the father's setting up to surprise the kids to actually have something really horrific in the museum. Mind you, Slappy's already locked up and put away at another part of the museum. Well, by accident, Kathy's older sister is said to have to work the event that night. So in preparation, she's setting up Aragotis' display and accidentally reads a translation from a sheet that somehow brings Aragotis to life. And all the kids freak out. Kathy, her sister, and her cousin have to deal with Aragotis coming to life. And they get kind of flustered. And the uncle gets involved. They end up going, well, after the fact, but they end up going to the uncle's study to try to find the papers associated with Aragotis. And Aragotis ends up going in there, making a big old mess. But they end up finding what they needed eventually. And managed to put the mummy back to sleep with the help of the uncle. And they put him back in the display. And the uncle's a little bit shaken up and said, well, we got to go on with the party, even though the uncle thinks that it's a better idea not to go on with it because there's a dangerous mummy. And the kids are like, well, it's not only the mummy coming to life, we have a dummy coming to life too. But they can't really do anything about it because they already promised these kids, and they show up. And they start the exhibit like normal. Kids are eating pizza. They're touring the museum, going into different rooms. And one of the kids ends up being a kid that we met in part 2 named Aaron. Now, a part of the story involves them going on this scavenger hunt, trying to find these amber stones with like bugs inside of them. And whoever finds the most ends up winning a prize. And that seems to be like the bulk of the story in this part. So they go on this scavenger hunt. We see that Aaron's involved in the story. And once the scavenger hunt's over, all the kids seem to be bored. And the father seems to be, kind of hurt by this because he doesn't really want to show him Aragotis because he hasn't witnessed the dummy stuff with Slappy, but he did witness Aragotis and has tried to put a stop on Aragotis for the time being until he feels like it's going to be safe enough for them to go look. Well, he gets the bright idea to go unlock wherever he locks Slappy up and brings him out and tries to show the kids Slappy. But Aaron sees this and freaks out and tells everybody that Slappy's evil, and he puts 2 and 2 together that his father must have dropped Slappy off at the museum, and that's who must have given the museum Slappy. And that connects part 2 to part 3. And this leads up into the final act, right? So what ends up happening is that somehow, while, the father brings out Slappy to show everyone, Aragotis ends up coming back to life because there was a mishap when the father had some papers where he wanted to kind of play around with the kids and maybe teeter with reading the spell on the paper. Well, the paper, instead of saying Slappy's spell, it said the mummy spell. And it brought Aragotis to life. And Aragotis comes to life, and the kids all think it's cool at first. But when they realize it's a real mummy, they freak out, and everybody starts scattering and running. And this leaves Kathy, her sister, and her cousin pretty much forced with no option but to resort to maybe bringing Slappy to life because the papers in his box said that he could be powerful and such. And they basically have to rely on Slappy to be an anti-hero. So reluctantly, they try to look for Slappy's papers. They can't seem to find it anywhere. But Aaron remembers something about Slappy, and he looks into Slappy's pocket and sees a card inside. And they read Slappy's spell, like the backup spell that's always on Slappy, and it brings Slappy to life. Now Slappy sees what's going on with Aragotis. Aragotis is messing with the kids. Everybody else has fled upstairs to hide in some of the rooms. And the kids are pleading with Slappy to help And Slappy's like, I don't know why I have to help you. You know, there's nothing in it for me. But Aragotis notices that Slappy has come to life, and instead of messing with the kids, now he wants to mess with Slappy. And Aragotis starts beating up Slappy, and this is pretty much the entire climax of the book. It's essentially just Aragotis and Slappy having a big old fight. And some of this stuff was so much fun. So Aragotis is trying to beat up Slappy. Slappy's getting like manhandled, thrown around the room, and he's getting agitated, trying to talk with Aragotis. He's making lines like, "Oh, you don't want to be friends. I see how it is." And Slappy's getting angrier and angrier about Aragotis just, throwing him around like a rag doll. So Slappy does this thing with his eyes that glow bright red, and he thinks that it's going to like stun him and freeze him, and everybody's like, all the other kids around are like closing their eyes, but it doesn't seem to do anything to Aragotis. And Slappy tries all of his tricks that normally work, but it doesn't seem to work on a supernatural mummy, because the mummy's magic is kind of implied to be almost as equal as Slappy's magic. And I don't want to spoil the rest of the climax because I want you guys to experience it, but it is so much fun. And now, once you realize what happens at the climax, something may or may not happen to where they're able to potentially deal with Aragotis, but now they also have to deal with Slappy at the same time, right? And this leads to the ending, because now that they've dealt with Aragotis, they got to deal with Slappy, and something may happen to Slappy. Let's just say that. And the ending involves Kathy looking for a piece of paper to kind of help out with the situation, and something happens there. Not to mention, there's also a revelation with Aragotis. When there's something to be implied with Slappy, that Slappy actually becomes more of the problem than Aragotis. And there's a reveal about Aragotis that's kind of silly too, thrown in there, that I might as well mention here. But that's essentially the Dummy Meets the Mummy book. So let's start off with positives here. The first positive I want to give Stein here is for delivering a fun and memorable book. All around, this is something that longtime fans deserve. I've been championing a Dr. Maniac versus Max Mutant book. If we can get a Dummy and Mummy book dealing with like magical creatures coming to life, why can't we get a comic book fight? Why can't we get a werewolf versus monster or vampire book, or something like that? This works so well. And part of it, I think part of its charm is how much effort Stein put into tying together all these characters from Arc 2 and Arc 3 that we meet, tie them together, and how they handle the situation at the end. I thought that was really cool. I like the perspective changes throughout this book. You had like 3 main perspectives of that explorer guy. Well, that was more third person, but he was still the perspective you got there, kind of. Then you got Aaron's perspective, then you got Kathy's perspective. And I like when Goosebumps does that. It's very reminiscent to the episode Haunted Mass 2 to me, and I love that setup where you get multiple perspectives and you can argue that there's 2 main characters. I love that. And this does that and delivers that, and it just makes it stand out for its setup. The location, it's not the most atmospheric book ever, but I love that it's set in a haunted horror museum. And I love the dynamic between Kathy and her father. Her father seems like how I would be if I was a dad. Just an eclectic guy collecting horror things. That's me. I felt vindicated reading this book. And the characters, they're not the greatest things ever, but they're serviceable. They're really fun and entertaining characters with good dynamics and stuff. I think the cousin's name is Logan, I want to say. He had some funny one-liners. The older sister had some kind of questionable bits because, she's trying to work the event and stuff, and, she's the one that kind of set him forth, bringing Aragotis to life originally, but she didn't know, and there's some plausible deniability there with some characters. Most people, in most books, Stein doesn't make that effort, and it would come off stupid, but he actually put effort in here to make all that dumb decision-making make sense. And it was just a fun, well-balanced story all in all. Aragotis, the prologue, was excellent. It was so graphic, it was so brutal. I was really not expecting that in a Goosebumps book, especially in a Slappyworld book. I was just blown away. Slappy, even though he has more of that Mr. Wood in him in this story, I think this is my favorite Slappywood I've seen that's been done or been attempted to be done since Bride of the Living Dummy. It's fine, like more than fine actually. I think he's pretty good here. I finally understand the appeal of this version of Slappy because of this book. It just clicked. Everything clicked. The premise of the story sounded fun, like an overnight staying at a museum. That just sounds so cool, and getting to see all these horror exhibits, and some of the pop culture references in here were awesome. There's some love letters to like Frankenstein and stuff. That was so cool and neat to see. Yeah, this book made me grin ear to ear reading this. I mean, I could not put down the book once I started. I was glued to this, and that's rare. And I was so happy that this book was finally delivering, something I've kind of low-key wanted from Slappy all these years. But then we get to the resolution of the climax in the ending. Okay? Pretty much everything about this book is a home run. Home run A++. Until the climax in the ending, which I have to say, y'all, the resolution of the climax and the ending is some of the goofiest and possibly some of the worst endings I've read in Goosebumps. And it's such a shame when you have a book of this caliber, right? With this much fun, this much ingenuity, and you just ruin it with poor answers and poor decision making at the end. Now, let me get into the resolution of the climax first. The resolution of the climax involves Aragotis, right? And I've kind of already mentioned it in the plot of review, where there's a revelation about Aragotis. And let's just say it involves tickling and laughing, okay? And that's all I'm going to leave it as. But that tonal change, it's such a pivotal point of the book, where it's about to wrap up and send this almost perfect story home, is insulting. I mean, Aragotis is implied that he just wants to be hugged, tickled, and laugh. I don't know how you can go from a prologue that dark and that graphic and brutal and then go to that. That's almost as absurd as what happened in The Haunter, where you had this really dark and gloomy build, the first two parts of it, and then you get to the third part and it's just silly dancing and nonsense. But here, it's basically the same thing. You have this dark story that's also fun and kind of using ingenuity that you don't see in these books, and then you just muffle it up with that, and then we get into the ending. And after everything that Kathy has gone through in her portion of the story, I understand it's implied that she was in the heat of the moment trying to deal with something. And let's just say it's Slappy, right? And it involves her getting involved, and it involves the papers that have been associated with both Aragotis and Slappy, and it's implied that the father might have mixed them up, right? But given that there's already been an accident with these papers, and her decision at the end, let's just say it, the last sentence implies that she makes a really dumb decision. And that to me just shows that Stein really didn't know what to do to wrap the story up. He just kind of threw out something really dumb to kind of make the reader think, oh, it's going to keep going on. And it's just really cheap and really just a slap in the face, honestly. Kathy was an alright character, right? And I can understand the situation she's in, but anybody with a brain that went through something already like this would at least give themselves a few seconds before they just do what she did. I'll just leave it at that. It's really unbelievable. It's really dumb, kind of intelligence insulting, and coupled with the resolution with Eric Otis in the climax, it tanks this book down a bit. And you know, this ending makes me really think about Slappy's Nightmares ending, about how much that I hate pretty much that entire last paragraph of that book. But here, it's almost the same thing, but when I think back to that book, at least there's hints about that book. At least they were set up with that to make that make sense. And for that, that's appropriate, and I can maybe let that pass, and maybe not as harshly as I used to, hold against it. But here, it's just nonsense being thrown at the proverbial wall to wrap up the story. And I can't excuse it. And it's such a disappointment. It's very reminiscent to books like Don't Scream, which, if Don't Scream had a better ending, that would be one of my all-time favorite Goosebumps books. One of the best, hands down. And I would be promoting that. I still think it's probably one of the best still, but that ending really holds it back for me. Here is no different, but it's more severe, because it involves pretty much the entire resolution of the book. And it's just really disappointing, because if it had just a good resolution to the climax and a great ending, this would easily be one of the best Goosebumps books of all time, but I can't endorse it like that. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, from this book being essentially perfect down to those two big glaring eyesores of the book, I thought about it. And those things added together took off some significant points. Significant points. Now, I originally wanted to give it a 4.5 out of 5, which is an A- for those two things. But since this book is so good, I'm willing to bump this book up to a 4.6 out of 5. I'm not willing to put it above Night of the Living Dummy 2, but I'll tie it there. Yeah, I really love this book. It has its flaws. Some people might agree, might disagree with what my flaws are with the book, but I had a blast with this, and I can't recommend it enough if you haven't tried this book. So yeah, that's my thoughts on The Dummy Meets the Mummy. Let me know down in the comment section. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.